Welcome to season 3 of Two Girls with Grief. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Kendall, and together we're just two girls figuring out how to live with grief the best we can.
This season, we wanted to have real conversations about building a beautiful life with grief. Because while grief never fully goes away, we believe it's still possible to build a life that holds love, joy, and even hope alongside it.
Our hope is that these episodes will be a resource for both new and seasoned grievers, whether you're in the early days of loss or years down the road.
And just a reminder, we're not professionals, we're just professional grievers. This is a safe place for honest stories, tools, and reflections that remind you you're not alone in this.
So, thank you for being here, for listening, and for letting us share this season with you. We're so grateful you're with us for season 3, Building a Beautiful Life with Grief.
Welcome back to Two Girls with Grief. Today we're diving into a topic that's both heartbreaking and deeply hopeful: how children experience grief.
We know that 1 in 11 kids will lose a parent or a sibling before they turn 18. And to me, that's such a staggering number. It reminds me of how it is really important to be talking about grief and what that looks like for children and how we can support them in that journey.
Today we're joined by Kelly Peterson, LCSW, the Camp Erin Online's program manager. She will support in the developing and launching Eluna's first ever direct care support through online programs. Their work gives grieving kids a chance to still be kids, and we can't wait to learn more.
Welcome to the podcast, Kelly. We're so happy to have you here.
Hello.
So, for listeners who may not be familiar, do you mind explaining what Camp Erin is and what Eluna is, and how they came to be?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I am really excited to be here and just want to take a minute and say thank you for inviting me, but also just thank you for your efforts and joining me in this idea of normalizing grief and building community around it. I love what I read about your podcast and I'm just super here for it. So thank you for all that you all are doing. So I'll share a little bit about Eluna and Camp Erin. Eluna is a nonprofit organization with the mission to support kids and families impacted by grief or addiction. We have 3 signature programs. We have Camp Erin, which obviously I'll talk more about here in a minute, but we also have Camp Mariposa, which is our free year-round addiction prevention and mentoring program for kids ages 9 to 17 who are affected by a substance use of a family member. We also have our Eluna Resource Center, which I think is a huge opportunity that is just still kind of under the radar, which kind of surprises me. But it is an online hub of tools and resources and support to help guide families impacted by grief, addiction, and really anything kid and family related. So that is Eluna. Camp Erin is our program that supports families impacted by grief. It came about because of the namesake Erin Metcalf. She was 15 years old, developed cancer, and as part of a Make-A-Wish experience, she got an opportunity to meet Karen Phelps Moyer and Jamie Moyer, and they just fell in love with her. And their heart connection really was the reason for the Moyers creating the Moyer Foundation back in 2000. Camp Erin was the first program of that, and we started in 2002 supporting kids and teens who experienced the death of someone significant in their life. And now really it is one of the largest free bereavement programs across the nation. And we support thousands of kids and families annually. And that is just a really cool program to know about. Now, the goal of Camp Erin is really to provide a safe space for kids and teens to explore their grief, build coping skills, and really just find connection with others who have experienced grief. So we now have locations in over 30 places across the US and Canada. And really the program model has expanded a lot in the last couple of years, where we host day programs and weekend programs, some that are just for kids, but also some that are for families as well. And lastly, I would, of course, be remiss if I did not mention that we also have online programming as well. And that's my jam. I do Camp Erin online, and so we host caregiver workshops and online support through that. Ooh, that was a lot.
Man. Yeah, you got a plethora of resources. So yeah, for listeners who could totally take advantage of this is worth checking out.
Yes.
Just a clarifying question. For the online programs, is that only for caregivers or is that also for kids, or who's that for?
That's a great question. The focus of Camp Erin in general is on the kids, but we recognize that kids don't grieve alone and we want to support the whole family. So both for in-person programming and for Camp Erin Online, the focus really is on how do we support our kids, but we offer caregiver workshops that focus in on how do we support the caregiver in supporting their child, which sometimes involves some of their own processing of grief, but mostly focuses on, how do I support my child through this really hard thing that we're experiencing as a family? And all of the program that we offer is offered at no charge, which I think is probably something I should have said right up front and completely just spaced. So there you go. At no charge. All 3 programs are offered at no charge.
That's amazing. So, we shared earlier in the episode the statistic that 1 in 11 kids lose a parent or sibling before 18. And feel free to correct us if that is not correct. But that statistic is staggering. So, what are some common ways grief shows up for kids and teens after significant loss that people can look out for?
Yeah, that is a staggering statistic and absolutely the one that we use as well. I always just like to point out that that statistic doesn't even account for all of the kids who are grieving a death of someone else significant. So that's just parent and sibling, but that doesn't account for people who are remembering their grandparents or a best friend or a teacher, a mentor, anybody else in that. So that number is just 1 in 11 is crazy, but to think about it being really significantly more than that. But, some common ways that grief shows up, honestly, it shows up in every part of who we are. Most obviously, kids experience lots of emotions. We talk about the fact that grief is more than just sadness. It's all of the feelings that we experience: anger, worry, embarrassment, guilt, regret, all the things. A lot of people are surprised by the way grief shows up in our bodies, and that it often impacts our sleep and it impacts our appetite, and we have a hard time focusing or sitting still. Kids often talk about feeling alone in their grief, like nobody could possibly understand what I'm going through. Nobody understands it. And that really often changes how they interact with their peers. They really tend to avoid talking about their grief, typically speaking, at home, especially because they don't want to be the person who caused the other people in their family to be sad. And so that is something that we hear a lot. Overwhelming questions about why, and just having unanswered questions about what happened and why did this happen and why did it happen to them and why did it happen during this time. So it really does impact every single part of who we are: the emotional, the physical, the social, the spiritual, just every part of who we are. And it is really, really hard for not just kids and teens, but grown-ups too, all of the above.
Yeah, so Rachel and I had our own grief experiences starting in adults, and I think as finding our grief community here, it's easy to recognize and talk about these symptoms of grief as an adult. But for children who don't have the words to express this to themselves, but besides to other peers themselves, it can look very different in how they articulate it, how it shows up. So, do you mind digging into that a little deeper, explaining how grief looks different for children versus adults? And this could be emotionally, behaviorally, or even developmentally.
Yeah, actually, I talk a lot about the fact that kids actually grieve really similarly to grown-ups. The difference is, just like you said, that they don't have the life experience that might teach them what to do with their grief. Not that as grown-ups we have that either all the time, because it's always different. But as you said, they don't necessarily have the words to express what's going on with those big thoughts and those big feelings and what's happening in their body. They haven't experienced life in a way that gives them, the value of knowing what a coping skill is, or knowing what mindfulness is, or identifying that support that's around them. And we know that those are all big things that help us through grief as grown-ups. I would say one really noticeable difference for kids is that they often grieve in what we call bursts or waves. So that looks like, a kid who may have been has experienced the death of somebody close to them, and they're at a playground, and all of a sudden they get really tearful because something somehow sparked that connection with the person who died, and so they're sad and they grieve, and they grieve intensely in that moment because they are feeling that grief so intensely. But typically they only stay in that for a short period of time. And so they may ask some rapid fire questions like, but what about this? And how about this? And what about that? And I'm really feeling all these things. And then, 3 minutes later, they're back at the playground playing because they only can handle it in these little bursts. And then their brains are kind of like, okay, let's get out of that because that's not comfortable. So, that's one thing that we notice. Another more obvious difference between kids and grown-ups is this idea of regrief. And we as grown-ups do this too, but because kids are kids, they go through it more often and they go through it sometimes more intensely than grown-ups. So what that might look like is, again, a kid is going to grieve as they go through future life milestones. So let's say a kid is remembering their dad who died when they were 6. That kid is going to experience regrief each time they do something that they wish their dad could be there for. So that could be winning a basketball game, that could be getting a boyfriend, or celebrating a special birthday, or graduating, or choosing college, or getting married, or having babies. All those things, like all those things that they wish their dad could have been there for, that's going to bring up that grief again. And then they're going to experience this, what we kind of have termed regrief. And those are just, big iceberg moments, not necessarily those equally sometimes challenging ones of just daily life, wishing that they were here for that particular moment. So I would say those are kind of the things that stand out to me as what's different about kids and grown-ups as we grieve, but it really is very similar. The full body, full life experience.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for digging into that and explaining how we could be more attuned to kids as they go through their grieving journey.
Yeah, I mean, we both don't have kids, so it's something that we thought this was an important conversation, and which is why we wanted to have this conversation and really talk about how to support kids so that they still live a beautiful life, even dealing with loss at such a young age. So, we're really happy to have this conversation. But for parents and caregivers who are also grieving themselves, what are some of the biggest challenges you've seen that they face trying to support their child through loss?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is just really intentionally setting time and space aside to actually do the work. Life is crazy busy for everybody all the time with so many things that we're doing and a long to-do list that we don't often make time and space to actually do what grief requires from us, which is to grieve, right? And often there are so many other things that are going to be way more fun than taking the time to do the grief work. It's hard work. So I would say, that is one of the biggest challenges is just making the time and space. I think secondly, what comes to mind for me is just like creating space for the conversation and opening that conversation with kids. I think it's kind of double edged in that the kids are really worried that if they bring it up, they're going to make their grown up sad. And the grown-ups are really worried that if they are sad in front of their kids, that that's going to be some detriment to the child. Like they don't want to experience their grief in front of their children. But we know and really do value the fact that kids need to see their grown-ups be sad. They need role models on what is grief and what is it supposed to look like. They need to understand, kids need to be able to understand that it is sad and it is okay to be sad and that it is okay to be tearful and to feel feelings and all of those things. And so I think those are the biggest challenges to why parents and caregivers have a difficult time working through grief together with their kids. So I feel like one of the most important things for us to do for our kids is to use the words and to talk about grief. We talk a lot about in our field how important it is for us to use the words death, dying, died, and grief. We have a tendency to avoid those because they're hard and we feel like we're going to hurt the kids when we use these words. And so we use words like passed away or they fell asleep and never woke up or those kinds of things. And so it really is so incredibly important to use the right words so that we're not making it more complex and more misunderstood. And so that I think is really important, being able to provide those the role model and being able to use the right words to support them in understanding what's going on. The other words make it way more complex and create a lot of confusion for kids.
I think this is a wonderful segue to dive into how to begin that conversation with a child when people are experiencing grief. And if it's their first time going through this, they may not even have the language themselves. And now they're having to communicate this with their kids. So, do you have tips on how parents can talk about death and get that ball rolling?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to cover here in what specifically we're talking about. Are we doing death notification? That's a whole different situation. But I think What we're talking about mostly is just how do we open that conversation. And I think one thing to keep in mind is, providing bite-sized information and really letting kids take a little piece of information and process it, and then asking them if they have questions. They will ask questions. We typically are surprised at the wisdom that they carry. And I think it's important to let them ask questions and figure out what they know and what they don't know and what they really want to know, versus us just trying to lead that conversation and tell them all the things in one moment, because that's really, really hard and overwhelming for a child. So I think giving them a little bit of information, asking what they want to know, asking what questions they have, remembering that as grownups, it's okay for us to say, I don't know the answer. I think that's a powerful thing for kids to see their grownups not have all the answers and to be okay with that. A couple of things that I have learned over the years that have been helpful for me in opening up the conversation is learning to ask things like, how's your heart today? It feels different than, how are you? Or, all those like kind of surface level things. When we ask, how's your heart today? We're more likely to get a heart-centered answer. And so I think that's a really powerful question. I think it's powerful to let kids tell us what they already know when they open up the conversation and are allowed to lead the conversation with, you know what, I heard this thing and I really just don't understand it. Then we figure out what's important to them. We figure out what they want to know and what they want to learn about in those moments. So those are some things that I feel like as grownups, we feel like we need to lead the conversation, where I feel like the most important thing as a grownup is to allow the child to lead it, both in what do they want to know, but also at their pace. Because remember, they're only going to be able to sit there and have a conversation with you for a few moments. They're not going to sit down and talk for hours and hours and hours about this really big thing. They're going to need to do little bits and pieces at a time.
I think those are wonderful tips and great advice to share with not only parents, but anybody who works with children experiencing grief. So I appreciate you so much extending that information.
Yeah, also pointing out, you said asking, how are you? I also feel like people often ask that when someone's grieving, whether they're a child or not, and they're not really expecting you to answer anything other than I'm fine or I'm okay. And
Yeah, we
it
throw
really
people off
leaves it.
when we actually answer correctly, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Every time, every time I actually answered honestly to people, crickets, like
Right.
right
I have
after grief.
no
And it's
idea.
like, why did you ask me that? And I even had people that would ask me like regularly, but every time I replied, they wouldn't say anything, but they just kept like reaching out, asking, how are you? And I'm like, why are you asking me if I answer anything other than I'm fine? So I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think it also sometimes when someone asks you that, you also don't know, like, should I answer honestly?
Right.
What should I say about how I'm doing? There's how are you is such a broad question. And when you're dealing with like, well, today was fine, but I'm still sad, like there's so many different layers to it. So I think it's important to point out, like, sometimes asking them a very specific thing can be helpful, but also get the right answer that you're looking for.
Yeah.
So, do you have any practical ways parents can model healthy grieving behaviors for their children? Because you mentioned before, sometimes it's like the parents don't want to be sad for the children. This children don't want to be sad for the parents. They don't want to cause any more pain for each other. And we had a father on, this episode might come out before that episode, but we have a father on that lost his wife and he has a daughter. And he talked about a lot of those dynamics, but it's very tricky, right? And he's still figuring that out. He's still learning. What tips do you have for parents that are having a hard time navigating that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate that it is really genuinely okay for your kids to see you grieve. They are watching, and we want them to know the idea that it's better out than in. When we hold it in, first of all, it doesn't work. We all know that doesn't work. It eventually finds its way out. But when we hold it in, we also are trying to do it alone. We're trying to do this really hard thing that some of us have never navigated before on our own. And that's just really hard. When grown-ups lead by example and allow it to be out, we can do it together. And even though it's really super hard while we're doing it, we often feel better because we did it together. It's really important for us to acknowledge our grief as grown-ups, to be able to say, I'm really feeling sad today because today would have been such and such, or I'm really noticing that I'm feeling more worried because we're getting closer to the day that daddy died, or that Remembrance Day is coming up. And so when we're acknowledging those things, we're giving kids permission to acknowledge them as well, so that they're not trying to hold all of those things together. Um, Another really practical tip is creating some way for like a kid to say, "Hey, I would like to talk." And, maybe that's in a notebook, or maybe that's a magnet on the fridge, or, something like that. So that even if it's not in that moment, there is an indication that it would be great to have a conversation soon. Like, I'm feeling it. Whether it's the kid saying it to the grown up or the grown up saying it to the kid, I think being able to have some like tangible cue for each other, or a special phrase, like even if it's a silly phrase that only they know what it is, like, hey, I could use a check in kind of thing. Maybe it's banana pants. I don't know. Like, it could be something silly that only the two of them know, but it's their way of saying, hey, I could use a check in. The other really practical thing for grown-ups is to practice using coping skills and call them what they are. If if this dad recognizes that, anniversary, I try to use Remembrance Day. Actually, I try to use Remembrance Day over Anniversary Day, but this Remembrance Day is coming up. What if we did something together, to honor and remember? Or what are some things that we could do to take care of ourselves before this day comes up, so that we really can, support each other in that. I think it's really important for grown-ups and kids to try on lots of different kinds of coping skills. There's so many out there, and we don't often know what works for us until we try it. And so why not make it, a little bit fun and try practicing some of those coping skills together as a family, whether it's going for a walk or playing a sport, or even taking some time to journal together, like sitting across the table. You have yours, I have mine. But really practicing those self-care coping skills strategies. I'll take a moment to just talk about the fact that in my world, I talk a lot about coping skills, but I talk a lot about coping skills in that there are two different kinds. There's a coping skill that we call step in coping skill, and there's a coping skill called step out coping skill. So a stepping out coping skill is something that you might do that helps you feel better, that really just allows you to focus on something fun, right? It's playing basketball, it's having a dance party, it's baking cookies, something that allows you to be focused on something other than your grief, at least momentarily, so that you can feel better, right? And then there's stepping in coping skills, which is like stepping into the grief process, that look different. They both have value, but we have to figure out how to use them both well. So a stepping in coping skill is something more like, okay, I'm going to journal. I'm going to talk about my grief to a friend. I'm going to listen to music that reminds me of my person. I'm going to write a song that expresses how I feel. So there's a difference between those stepping in coping skills versus the stepping out coping skills that are, again, both have value, both are really important. And it's important for us to teach kids how to use both. So that's just a little something I like to teach about.
I love that. We've actually talked a lot. I think more in season 1 we talked about like try everything. You don't know what's going to work for your grief. And I've never heard it organized in that way, but I think that's so important. There's ways to like you deal with your grief directly, but also you have to still enjoy life and you still have to experience life. And sometimes grief makes you not want to do that thing. So it's very interesting to hear it explained that way, because it's stuff that we talked about, but not in those terms. And I think that's really important on
Yeah,
the grief process.
I think that's another really important piece for like talking about kids and grief is sometimes kids, just like grown-ups, they're worried that if they have fun, they smile, they start to enjoy life again, that other people are going to think that they're like over it, right? And so they hold on to some of that grief and some of the heaviness of their grief because they're worried about what other people might think if they smile, if they still move forward in life and enjoy life. And so I think, again, that's really just beautiful conversation to have with kids, that, oh my gosh, yes, it's absolutely okay for you to still enjoy the things that you enjoy, and do things that help us to feel better. Like, we don't have to stay in the heaviness all the time. We can use coping skills. We can use these activities that bring joy to us to help us keep moving through our grief.
Absolutely. And I think this perfectly dovetails into what we're about to talk about next and talking about Camp Erin. And
Yeah.
so you gave an overview of what Camp Erin is, but can you explain to the listeners what a typical day might look like? And what is that balance between grief activities and then fun camp activities and those friendships kids make along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh, I'm a big fan of Camp Erin, obviously. I typically, in my current day, in my current work, I do Camp Erin online, which is super fun, but there is something really super special about in person programming. So, that's what I'm going to describe a little bit more about right now. As I said, we have Camp Erin's in over 30 locations now, and all of our camps look a little bit different. Some of them are doing day programs for just the kids and teens. Some of them are family programs where they really do focus on family programming and how do we do this grief thing together. Some are overnight, and some are just as I said, just day programs. And so it really depends on the location to be really specific about what a specific day looks like at Camp Erin. But ultimately, all of the camps, the goal is to really provide this combination of fun traditional camp activities combined with grief support opportunities. And so, the camp fun activities, some of these things are things that kids have never gotten a chance to do before, like lake swimming and rock wall climbing and canoeing and zip lining and campfires and singing silly songs. The fun traditional camp stuff, again, reminding them they're still kids. We still want you to be kids. We still want you to have kid like experiences. But every camp is also combined with activities that help them explore their grief. Again, something some of these kids have never had an opportunity to do. They may live in a house where we don't talk about it, whether that's said or not said. Some kids show up at camp and they've never said out loud that their person died. And we want to give them those opportunities to talk about their grief. It's always, always, always a rule that they have the right to pass. But when we're at camp, we talk about building that toolkit of coping skills, how important it is to try all the different kinds. We give them opportunities to practice them. We talk about identifying the support people, thinking about who's in your circle that you can go to when you need support. We talk about the importance of sharing their story to the people they feel safest to do so. And we really do focus on honoring and remembering the person who died. And so at camp, we have these two really beautiful ceremonies that happen at every camp location that we do. We have a memory board ceremony where the kids are able to post a picture up on a community board and share who they're remembering. And that is kind of done at the beginning of camp and just serves a purpose of recognizing that everyone here is remembering somebody. We have this one thing in common. Even if we come with all these different stories and all these different experiences, there's one thing that unites us. And then towards the end of the weekend camp, or if it's a day program, it's usually at the end of the day program experience, we host a luminary ceremony. And the luminary ceremony is just a really beautiful opportunity to honor and remember. It looks different at all of our camps, but definitely a somber moment, and that permission to be in your feels and permission to honor and remember through like a candlelight ceremony. It's really sweet.
That is so great. Do you also mind explaining the layout of Camp Erin online since it's a little different than the in person?
Yeah, so at Camp Erin Online, it is different. It's not for everybody, but we do find that it is meeting the needs of a lot of families that aren't able to get to an in-person program, or maybe don't want to go to an in-person program, or maybe it works better for them to join from their home. We have done a lot of really special events where we look at, most of them are focused on coping skills, practicing something new. So we've done programs where kids can come and practice the art of photography and how to use photography in their grief expression. That was one of my favorites. We've done some art therapy kind of work. We talk about how can we use music and lyrics in our grief work. So really just, creating opportunities to practice those, be again with other people who understand what this thing called grief is. We just did a writing workshop, which was really powerful. So sometimes those events are really targeted to our younger kiddos that are like, 7 to 10, 7 to 12. And then we try to do some that are also focused on providing that space for teens. So this teen workshop was just so sweet. We had a amazing guest. Laurel Braitman came and did a writing workshop with us. And these teens were like blowing our minds with the things that they were writing about. Again, like so much wisdom and learn like lived experience. So I think for Camp Erin Online, we really focus in on like, it doesn't have to be like this big, hard. I mean, it is hard and heavy, but we can do the things that we enjoy and we can bring the things that we enjoy into processing our grief, like writing, art, music, those kinds of things.
That's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
So, from those two programs, it does seem like the connection and peer connection for children is such an important part that makes a camp so special, at least for the in person camp portion.
Yeah.
For kids who might feel isolated in their grief, how do you explain, maybe even to them or their parents that are on the fence, should we do the extra effort of doing in person if there's an online program? How would you tell parents and teens or children how those relationships help? And like, how would you pitch that to them to like make that extra step?
Yeah. So by far, the most powerful and frequent feedback that we hear from campers, it's consistent across the board, is that, once they have attended a Camp Erin experience, they realize they're not alone. Grief is so incredibly isolating and it makes us feel like we're all alone. It makes us feel like no one could possibly understand what we're going through. And like, we just have to do it on our own. Like, we just got to figure it out by ourselves. But when they come to a program, some of them come kicking and screaming. Okay, not really, but we don't want that. But like, they definitely are worried about, what is this thing called grief camp? That sounds terrible. But when they come and they show up and they realize that they are with other people that have experienced grief, that is just really powerful. They see others who understand. They experience true empathy from grown-ups, but also from other kids. Really super powerful. And they often see for the first time that grief is something that they can get through. That it's not something that is going to end them. Like they're going to be able to get through it. It's going to be hard and they can do it because we can do hard things when we have the support of others. And so I can't tell you how many times we do these memory cards where we have the kids write down, like, what's one thing that you learned from camp? And they just like so often say, I didn't realize other people have been through this too. Like, I didn't realize that it's not just me. And that is the most powerful part of being at a camp experience.
Yeah, that's something Rachel and I have talked a lot about, and that grief, you're a part of a huge community of grievers, and yet it's so unspoken and so quiet. You're so right. Grief is incredibly isolating, and you feel like you're the only one on an island dealing with this. And then you find out, I don't know, half of everybody else you're meeting has experienced something like this. And it's fascinating to me that we don't talk about this more. And I think that's one of the kind of the origins of why we wanted to start this podcast, was just to encourage these conversations, and that we're not as isolated as we think. We might be alone in our grief journey, of course, but that there's so many people out there who are willing to help and want to share their experience. And I think that's the beautiful thing about what Eluna is doing, and with Camp Erin, and that just providing that community alone is life-saving for so many. So this work can't be done without the support and the hands-on work that volunteers and professionals are doing. So thank you for everyone who is involved in this and putting their time in to just care on these children who need people to love on them in this time. From your stance, what type of training and approaches are y'all taking to create safe and healing spaces for these children?
Yeah, well, we have learned so much from so many that we like to call these kids our little pint-sized philosophers, because they really are. That we've learned a lot from the people that we serve, and so when we really when we're doing these trainings for professionals and for volunteers, we really try to lean into what we've learned from them and encourage all the grown-ups who are interacting with kids and teens who are grieving to first and foremost release the pressure. that there is something somehow magically that you are going to say that you can fix this kid's grief. You can't fix it. We can't fix it. We can't take it away. We can come alongside and support them through their grief. So if we could just release that pressure from the whole world of we can't fix it, that is a huge priority. We can say things like, how's your heart today? Teach me about your grief and how it's showing up for you today. And then when they talk to us about it, we can recognize it and we can say, wow, that makes sense that you might feel this way. Really showing up for them in a way that allows them to tell their story, talk about their grief, and validate their experience. Validate that everybody experiences grief when somebody special dies. Everybody experiences it, but it's different for everybody. So teach me about yours. And then really, like I said, showing up and saying, oh man, that makes sense that you would feel that way. Like practice that saying. It is a powerful one. It makes sense that you would feel this way. Like that makes sense. I think another big piece of what we try to teach is reminding adults that we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that we should use them proportionately. We should be listening way more than we should be talking, and just, again, letting them tell their story, letting them tell about their experience, and just listen, providing them, judgment-free space to share, man, this is hard. This sucks. Yeah, it makes sense that you would feel that way, right? We encourage our professionals and our volunteers to do our best to paint a more realistic picture of what grief is, recognizing that it's not linear. It doesn't happen in stages that you have to cross off a checkbox. Oh, done with that one, never going to return to that. No, it is messy, and it demands that one thing from us, which is to grieve. I think part of one of the main things that I do is teaching about realistic expectations about grief, that we want it to be this thing that starts and finishes, and that we'll know exactly when we're done with it. And, one of the things that I spend a ton of time talking about is, nope, that's just not how it works. Grief is something that you will continuously live with forever. And as hard and sad as that seems, it does change over time, and it does change when we do something with it. And that something with it is really teaching about the power of connection. When we talk about how important it is for us to be connected and not do things on our own, these kids feel seen, and they feel heard, and they feel loved. And those are incredible protective factors. Just the power of being seen in my grief is so powerful as a grown-up, let alone these kids who, have been told for a really long time that they don't grieve. They're resilient. No, they're resilient, and they grieve, and they need support, and they need connection, and they need all those things to support them through their journey. So I think those are the primaries of, we can't fix it. We need to listen, and we need to validate them. We need to just give them space to share and say, hey, that you're right. This sucks, and this is hard, and there's nothing I can say that's going to fix it, but I'm here, and I care, and I'm going to show up for you.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important to share and how nuanced this all is, and especially for children, and how people often look at children's grief as you're young, you'll get over it, you don't even remember them anymore. I feel like people often kind of dismiss it, and I don't think that's a fair way for children to deal with their grief, or for society to look at grief. So I think this conversation hopefully will help a lot of people that even aren't experiencing child grief, or children that experience grief, or parents that are dealing with it, just to better understand it. Because I think it just, people often say these things thinking that it's helpful, and it's really not. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So each episode, we like to do a grief challenge segment, and we like to pause and have the listeners do a small grief challenge.
Kelly, what is a small bite-sized challenge that parents can do at home that can help their children through their grief? Something just real small and tangible that they can do in their day-to-day.
Well, I think the car is a really powerful place to open conversation. So the next time that you are in the car with your kiddo, ask them how their heart is. How's your heart today? What have you been thinking about lately? What is something that has been weighing on your heart? I think that is a really powerful way to just show up for your kid and recognizing that it's more than just like, how was your day today? But recognizing the depth of their person and giving them space to share if they want to.
That's beautiful. That's exactly what we were looking for.
Oh, good.
So we also like to have this conversation extend the impact, not it just be for the specific group of people. So for listeners who want to support grieving children in their own communities, what are some tangible ways that they can help? Like outside of camp, outside of these resources, like just day-to-day life?
Oh my gosh. Yes, yes, yes. First of all, thank you for the question because that's what I'm all about as well is, you know, reaching far beyond the kids and teens who are grieving. The thing that comes to mind for me is just to really encourage people to get grief informed. What an incredible difference it would make if everyone who interacted with a child, our teachers, our coaches, our mentors, our church communities, our doctors, social workers, advocates, all the things, what if they just had some really basic knowledge regarding what to say and what not to say? What if they knew how to show up well for someone who was grieving in, some really practical ways? I mean, things even like we've talked about today, it's not like it takes a full college degree to be able to show up better than we have been in the past couple of decades on how to show up for kids and even grown-ups who are grieving. There are tons and tons and tons of grief informed approaches to talking about this that I would just encourage people to do a little research and get yourself grief informed, and then to know where to go to find resources when you realize a child or a teen or a family that could use grief support. Like, you are their advocate. You are the person who is going to have the capacity to do that research for them when all they can do right now is figure out how to take the next step forward. Like, they can't spend all the time and energy trying to look up resources and figure out what's going to work for. Nope, they're just trying to take a step forward and breathe every day. So you are their advocate. Do the research for them, show up for them even after the casserole time of, let's take all the casseroles. Beyond that, the weeks after when things are settling down and the casseroles have stopped, show up with a packet of information on what are the resources that are available. Show up with a grief book. Like, there are a gajillion kids grief books out there. I have a ton of them right behind me. You can't even see them because all my shirts are in the way, but there is support out there. And we don't have to avoid the conversation. We can show up well for people.
That's incredible. And I think this podcast episode has been filled with tons of nuggets of information that people can take away. So those listening who feel really inspired and really encouraged, either they want to get involved in Camp Erin or with Eluna through volunteering or as a donor, or parents looking for resources or getting their kids involved, how can they learn more? How can they connect with y'all? And go into that for us.
Of course, yes. So we have a website that I would encourage you to go to. It's brand new. We just redid it and it's really pretty. So elunanetwork.org. So it's ELUNANETWORK.org. Lots of great information on there. If you want to be a support person, if you want to donate, if you are looking for support, there's tabs for all of it. So get in there and obviously reach out if there's anything we can do to help get you connected.
You mentioned that you have an event coming up in November. Can you please share that?
So we have a free online grief support opportunity coming up. It's a national luminary ceremony. It's going to take place on Thursday, November the 20th. This is actually our third annual Camp Erin National Luminary Ceremony. We are hosting this on Children's Grief Awareness Day, and it really is open to anyone who is interested in coming and just honoring and remembering together. It's a sweet guided remembrance ceremony, and it's just great. We get lots of positive feedback from it, so I'm excited to host it again this year.
Love that. I have some people that I can share that with as well. So for season 3, this is really focused on how to live a beautiful life with grief and kind of providing the conversations and the resources in order to do that. So every episode we like to highlight one moment of joy or some highlight from the week. So what is one thing that brought you joy this week?
Ooh, one thing that brought me this. Y'all, I love this kind of thing where we get to just talk openly about grief and break down those barriers about um, that prevent people from just dealing with the hard stuff. Like we try to avoid it. And when we can lean into the hard stuff, it makes a huge difference. So I've really enjoyed being able to talk to both of you, and I enjoy our shared vision for just, that we can do better for people who are grieving. So I know that's cheesy, but it's so true. This has brought a lot of joy to my heart.
It's a great answer. We love the answer. Kendall, what brought you joy this week, Kendall?
Yeah, with it being the time we're recording this, it's October, and I feel like a lot of things are ramping up towards the holidays. So I've been meeting with a lot of people that I haven't seen in a while, going to a lot of community events, and I'm sure for some people this has been a very hard year, but I'm trying to always focus on like how to continually give back into my community and how to be a member, a part of community, and giving and receiving and learning how to be an advocate and active in that way. So it's been busy and at some points exhaustive, but it is very restorative to my heart to reconnect with a lot of people and just say, like, we're in this together and we're here to help each other. So that's been really bright and inspiring. And then what about you, Rachel?
Okay, everyone has really good answers. I was literally gonna say, and I'll still say it. I got a box of Fruit Riot, like a PR box of Fruit Riot, which is just like a fruit snack. It's frozen fruit, and it's like either sour or sweet. And I got that box with a bunch of flavors and a cooler bag. And so that brought me a lot of joy, just having
It was
that.
a really cute bag that you posted about.
Yeah, so that brought me a lot of joy. Obviously, I had a lot of things happening last few weeks, but for this week specifically, that is what brought me joy, is a box of Frandy from Fruit Riot.
Love it.
So thank you so much for coming on our podcast. It's such an amazing conversation. I hope it really helps other people, helps parents, helps children. We're really trying to just normalize these conversations, just make it easier for people to have these conversations, because it's still very taboo. It's still very uncomfortable for people. And, we like to say we're always uncomfortable about our grief. It's okay if other people feel it too, because that's how you have that openness and connection, is by just kind of moving through the uncomfortable. So thank you so much for taking the time. We have a few other things coming up with Eluna in the future, so stay tuned for those announcements. We'll put it in the show notes of things coming up. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to join this episode.
Such an honor. Thank you so much.
It was great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us.
So that was an amazing episode with Kelly. I personally learned a lot. It was very eye-opening for me. But what are some key reflections or takeaways you have from this episode?
Yeah, number one, to be honest about it, just say it as it is, that we don't need to sugarcoat death to kids. That maybe in some ways we underestimate their experience with grief to try and comfort them from the pain. And yet, as everybody know who has experienced grief, know that there's nothing you can do to take that away. So to best help a child go through their grief experience, answer those questions, have that open dialogue, and to let them know that this is sad. Like, you don't have to pretend that everything's okay. But what about you?
I think there was two main things that really stuck with me. One, it's how often kids' grief and kids' pain is dismissed. And people are told, you're strong, you're young, you'll get over it, you'll grow out of it, type of thing. And that just means that you're grieving for longer, and you have to figure out how to deal with that grief through different periods of your life without the people that you love. And I think in many ways, it's harder in other instances, than other instances of grief, right? You don't maybe get to know somebody as much as you wanted to, right? A lot of it is you wishing for things, and it's a longer period of wishing. So I think hopefully people listening to this conversation will understand, like, just because they're kids doesn't mean that they're not experiencing grief, doesn't mean that they don't hold that grief and they're processing it. And for many kids, they probably didn't get the support they needed to actually deal with it. So hopefully even maybe some adults that are listening to this conversation that dealt with grief at a young age, hopefully it also helps them feel validated, feel seen, and get the support that they need as an adult, even if they lost someone as a young person. I think that's really important. And the second part would be things that we talked about that she mentioned, of having to do the things that bring you joy is dealing with your grief, and then dealing with your grief directly. But those are two ways to deal with your grief. And I think that's super important, because when you're only focusing on dealing with your grief, it can feel really heavy and isolating, all these things, and you forget about focusing on the joy and the excitement. And I think that's super important when you're walking around with so much grief to think about the excitement, to think about the joy, to think about the happiness. So I was glad that she brought that up, especially as like a therapist. Like she brought up how important that is. So those are two key takeaways that I am taking from this episode, and hopefully for the listeners as well.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll have the links to Camp Erin and Eluna down in the show notes. And as always, we are not professionals. We're just professional grievers learning how to live with joy and grief together.
Bye, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.